I'm so proud to have all of y'all here. My name is Charlotte Anderson. I'm your coordinator. So if there's anything that you need, you have any questions about the class, I will try to answer them for you. I can't guarantee I'll have the answer, but I will try to get them for you as best I can. So without any further ado, I will introduce you to Heidi Collier. She was a daughter of Fritz Wilhelm, and he was one of the German scientists. And so when I told Ed what I wanted to do, he said, oh, I've got to hook you up with Heidi Collier, because she is kind of the one that has kept all the families together throughout the years. And so she has a wealth of knowledge, and Heidi, we're so proud to have you in our panel, and there will be a different panel each week. Okay? So anyway, Heidi,
each month. The next one.
Each month, I'm sorry, this is not a week. That's
First Wednesday in September, and the next one the first Wednesday in October.
Thanks for correcting me on that.
Okay, I didn't want them to come unnecessarily next week.
Let's hear it for Heidi.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and read the prepared words that Ed and I had come up with so that I don't miss a single detail. The story of early rocket history is rather amazing. In Peenemünde, Germany, from the 1930s up until 1945, a few thousand men and women built the first successful rockets. As World War II ended, the American Army selected only a small group of these, about 120 men, led by Dr. Werner von Braun, to help jumpstart a space program for the United States. This group lived in Texas and New Mexico under uncertain circumstances for several years, but most stuck together. In 1950, as the Korean conflict and Cold War were starting, the von Braun team immigrated legally from Juarez and moved to Huntsville, Alabama, to start working more seriously on rocketry. In Huntsville, the team grew to include a few hundred Germans and thousands of Americans in pursuit of America's dream of conquering space. How remarkable that a still relatively small group of a few Germans and American space workers put aside animosity left over from the rather recent Second World War, forged ahead as a team, and put Americans on the moon by 1969. Today's presentation is made up of 4 panel members who were preschool-aged or school-aged children as they, with their mothers, arrived during the December 1946 to 1948 time frame to join their fathers and husbands already working at Fort Bliss and White Sands. I'll just put a little note in there. About half of the team was working in offices at Fort Bliss, writing proposals. The other half would go by bus daily out to White Sands, and they were helping put together the retrieved rocket parts and giving tours to captains of industry, GE, all the professors were coming in, and so forth. So, all right, let me find my place again.
No problem.
The families were housed in William Beaumont Annex housing, which had been a long-term medical care facility for World War II casualties. The compound was fenced to contain the Rocketeers and to keep them apart from the American military community, since many had just recently fought the Germans. So, as much for each other's safety, right? Also, the rocket scientists were essentially POWs who had been brought to the United States under a special act of Congress called Operation Paperclip. What was life like for these young children arriving from a war-torn country and thrust into an entirely foreign culture? So let me go ahead and introduce all 4, and then we're going to hear from them in this order. So first is Gisela Fulvig-Serrano, Klaus Rosinski, Uwe Huja, and Volker Lohl. Volker's brother was Axel Roth. So some of you probably remember he was the deputy director at Marshall Space Flight Center. And Volker likes to tease, and he uses the German pronunciation of his last name. So it's Volt. His brother called it Axel Roth. There you go. A little tidbit. So first, I'd like to introduce Gisela, who arrived in Fort Bliss with her twin sister Ursula in April 1947 with their mother. It was the twins' birthday. That day they arrived, and so she remembers it well. Now she will probably, let me give her a little bit of background. You settled and stayed in Huntsville and raised your family here. You have 3 children. Teo, volunteer extraordinaire here for the for duty and so forth. So she did quite a bit in the Huntsville community, and I see she has her son pointing out right there. Would you raise your hand, Teo? So this is Teo, her oldest. Then Greg is down in Florida, and Andrea with her family is in Indiana. So, all right, now, Gisela shared that she will start out a little bit earlier, so you get some continuity on her story. She's going to start out in Germany, what life was like for her there, so you have a little bit of comparison then once she arrived in the United States. So here we go.
Okay.
Gisela Fulvio-Serrano.
Public speaking at this stage of my life is a little bit unusual. It's not in my comfort zone.
You're among friends.
And since my childhood was a little bit unusual, I decided to write down my experiences for my children to read after I leave this earth. I had no idea my son knew I was coming here. So anyway, my twin sister and I were born in Detmold, Germany, on April 14th, 1937. We were baptized in the Lutheran religion, and while we were still in the hospital, and we never attended church services there in Germany. Perhaps it was because gatherings were discouraged, large gatherings during those times. So anyway, difficult times were soon to follow. The Second World War had started, and food was rationed. We relied heavily on our gardens. It seems like we were always hungry. I became accustomed to strange rumbling sounds in the sky. The sounds of attack sirens are still clear in my mind. Surprising. And after a while, my ears could determine which approaching planes carried bombs yet, and which still had theirs to unload. And most feared were those attack planes that appeared out of nowhere. So I remember nights in the cellar listening to the terrible sounds of bombs. I remember one time, I don't know how I snuck into an attic, but I watched the neighbor town aglow in fires of destruction, terrible. And I remember hiding on a railroad bridge when the planes from nowhere appeared. I remember accommodating families in our house who were called Flüchtlinge. They had lost everything but their lives. And most of our village was spared, and we seldom saw Fatih, that means father. He and his team were working on a secret government project in Peenemünde. And that was bombed very heavily. And my mother said that we were about to move there, and she had the keys in their possession, but the house and all the occupants were destroyed during this terrible air raid. So we stayed in Detmold. And let's see. Then when the war ended, I guess, did you tell them about how our fathers got to...
Well, that's some details, right? They
Yeah.
were giving themselves up to the
Yeah,
Americans. They were trying
and
to
they
find
ended
the
up in Garmisch, in the foothills of the
Garmisch,
Alps.
Partenkirchen, right.
And when the war ended, there'd been no word for many months from my father, and we feared the worst. Every family I knew had lost at least one male member to the war. And Mrs. Haller, who became Dr. Haller, UAH, let's see. Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself, But anyway, so, Mrs. Haller, not Heller, she was a neighbor. She lost 5 of her sons during the war. And then one day Fatih appeared, and it was a joyous day for us. He told us when they realized the war was lost, you know, they gathered them up and sent them to Garmisch, where they stayed for, I guess, several months until all of a sudden he appeared. And it was the happiest day of our life when we saw him, because we didn't know whether we'd ever see him again. And then immediately, let's see, where was I? Oh, yes. Germany at that time was divided into 3 sectors: the British, the American, and the Russian sector. And we lived in the British sector. And so after I attended 3 years of school in Detmold sporadically. You know, we were dismissed whenever air raids appeared. And after my daddy returns, I have until this day don't know how he got back from Garmisch to Detmold. But soon thereafter, I saw a British military truck parked in front of our house. And inside our apartment were 2 British officers. And they conveyed an offer for Fatih to continue his work in America. I guess the message was relayed through the American government. So shortly thereafter, a few belongings were put into a canvas-covered military truck. We found our seats in the back. And then as we traveled through Detmold, I still remember a lone figure standing there. And it was my Opa, my grandfather, waving goodbye. And so somewhere along the way, we were transferred to a train for our journey to Landshut. And there a new life for us began. The fathers were immediately shipped to a place in the desert in America, far from civilization, where large snakes were everywhere and strange dogs howled at night. Food was plentiful, and for recreation they played instruments and built furniture. And this place was called White Sands, New Mexico. So whenever possible, they sent home care packages with cigarettes and other things impossible to find in Germany. They were good to barter with. Meanwhile, the wife and children were settled into an apartment complex in Landshut. And we lived under the protection of the American military. And there was a little place called our school, and the American base was right next to ours. And the Isar River flowed nearby. And so we were there, and then at the foothills of the Alps. And life for us was much better than it was for almost anyone else in Germany. The country was destroyed and families were torn apart, and there was little food for most of the population. And so a year later, it became our turn to transfer to America. And I remember we all gathered around this bus as we left to sing Nun ade du mein lieb Heimatland. That means goodbye, my sweet homeland. And for that journey across the large sea. And when we reached the ship, a large hospital or Navy transport, my mother suggested we kiss the ground of our homeland, for we will never see it again. Which, of course, we did later. So it seemed like all of us were housed in a huge room with bunk beds. A lot of the adults, the mothers became seasick, but we had the time of our lives. Oh, gosh. And it took us for the journey, seemed like forever. It took like three weeks. Were you on that
Like
ship,
3
Klaus?
months.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
a lot longer.
So at last we reached New York, and all the passengers disembarked, but our group was ordered to remain on board. So one morning, buses arrived to transfer us to the train depot. And with military police escorts in tow, We waited patiently for our train to take us west. And as we were sitting there speaking German, two people approached, and they also spoke German. But they were soon ordered by our escorts not to indulge in any conversation with us. So they soon returned with candy in their hands. And that was our very, very first taste of candy, a candy bar. And I remember the rush of saliva as I bit into something so delicious and sweet. The train ride took 3 days. And we had our own car, which was connected to various trains headed west. And there were so many automobiles I saw. I'd never ridden in a car before. And ladies with hair that seemed to be blue. And they had paint on their faces. Finally, the big day arrived, and so we reached El Paso, and there stood my dad with a bouquet of flowers in his hand, and he appeared to be twice as heavy as he was when we left. So then Texas was a new beginning of the world for us. We lived in the desert, surrounded by barbed wire fences, on the compound. I guess it was called Research and Development or something like that, huh? It had 3 gates, each guarded by military police.
Right.
During our first summer, teachers were brought to our compound to give us some Berlitz sessions in English. We were to be integrated into the El Paso public school system that September. First, of course, we must learn patriotism. A large flag adorned the wall, American flag, and before our sessions began, we had to place our hands over our hearts and pledge allegiance. And then we sang, "My country lives on the wheat land of liberty, I see, I see." So then September arrived, and we were bused to the school with an MP escort always present. The authorities decided no more than 3 Germans in one classroom. I found myself once again in the 3rd grade. And my sister, they had high and low. And my sister was placed in low 3rd, and I think it was because I was a bit taller than she. And because there were no more than 3 Germans allowed in the same classroom. And but we also introduced German dodgeball to that school, which became a popular sport. And we tried hard to fit in. I was so impressed that the girls wore a different dress every day. My mother made all of our clothes, you know. Anyway. And and the boys, they all seemed to be related because they wore the same pants. They were called blue jeans. And they carried lunch boxes with white sandwiches, white bread, and they smelled so good. I took a bite of it one time, and it was called peanut butter and jelly. And then I was invited to spend the night with my new American friend one time, and Mutti made me a black velvet dress in Germany, all embroidered on the front. And the hem was large enough to last for several years of wear. And so my friend introduced me as a princess from Germany. And my father's first love was music. He played in the cello in symphonies wherever he lived. And of course he expected me to become a cellist also. So, somehow Crockett School provided me with a 3/4 size cello, which I was able to take home with me under the condition that I play it in their little school band. woodwind instrument. I couldn't even hear myself play, but at least I could take it home and, had my dad teach me. And so our compound in the desert was a converted military hospital base. Is that correct? And the barracks each contained 4 apartments.
Right.
And they were kind of vertically aligned, and a covered hallway was attached. However, we could only access it through the main road. And across the street from us, the single soldiers lived. And then ramp A and B contained German occupants. We planted morning glories, grass and flowers since water was free. Ramp C was occupied by Americans who took little pride in making the desert look like an oasis. And for recreation, we had a swimming pool. Our fathers developed rockets right there where we lived, so what more could we desire? Perhaps a little more freedom, maybe you know about that, to roam. So we dug holes under the fence, and they were covered up the next day.
That's true.
And so, after all, we were under guard. And my sister and I delivered newspapers. And on Fridays, when we collected the money, one lady, Mrs. Heller, who I mentioned before, became Dr. Heller, she gave us a tip. And we always sneaked to the PX and bought ourselves a candy bar. And then we would turn our profits over to our parents. And after a year or so, we had saved enough money to buy a Hawthorne bicycle at Sears and Roebuck. And